The punishment block, now called the Mitchell Block, is the only purpose-built building in the prison complex.
These cells were built as a punishment area for the prisoners. This was the only place on Spike Island prison where the prisoners could be held in individual cells in solitary. And we know we have records from many of the prisoners who were kept here. In particular, the political prisoners, the Fenians of the 1860s and 70s, discuss being incarcerated here in the punishment cell. The block now consists of a number of cells knocked together to form cells where 4 prisoners at a time could be housed. That was from the 1980s. But originally these were all individual cells on 2 floors with concrete floors, a single window, and the cells were not heated. And that's one of the things that the Fenian prisoners talk about. And the accounts of one of them, for example, in fact more than one of them, they talk about how their health was broken by being kept in these punishment cells over long periods. Now, as well as the punishment cells here, we also have little warders or guards rooms at either end. And the whole idea of the layout of these prison buildings was that the guards could observe that the surveillance of the prisoners was very easily done. So, for example, the guards are at either end of this corridor. You've got the individual cell doors and then a mezzanine with the same arrangement with the cell doors from that. The guards are stationed at either end of this corridor. And what we've done is we've excavated in 2 of the guards' rooms. Now the building is derelict, but the wooden floors in the guards' rooms have rotted out. So we're excavating the underfloor deposits. And we found some material from, I suppose, post-prison era, like demolition debris. We have a coin, a penny from the early 1900s, which is post-prison. But then we have other materials that may be from the prison period. So we have materials that would have been part of a tunic or a prison officer's uniform. They're not quite buttons, but the eye and hook to hold that uniform closed. Our hope is, not this season, but in subsequent seasons, to excavate some of the cells as well. Even if we find nothing, that would be interesting, to contrast the guards' rooms versus the prison cells. Now, a few of these prison cells, most have concrete floors now that were put in relatively recent years, but the original floors would have been wooden, and in some of the cells, the wooden floors have rotted out, the subfloors are present, and we can excavate there. And sometimes in archaeology, an absence is interesting in itself. So even if we find nothing there, it will tell us about the conditions under which the prisoners in punishment were kept. We have comparative studies from other prisons, for example, from one prison in Tasmania, where a lot of people from Spike Island were transported. We have punishment cells where material has been found in the subfloor deposits. So our hope is that we may get something similar here. Now, we know about the punishment regime because the prison records tell us about it. So, for example, we have very detailed records of the punishments meted out to prisoners from 1879 to 1883. The earlier period is, we only have summary data, whereas we have individual records of individual prisoners. And the usual punishment here for minor infractions was to be locked in these cells for just a couple of days or maybe a week on a reduced diet, reduced rations of bread and water. So you got less bread than you would in the rest of the prison, and obviously water rather than milk, and you didn't get the special Sunday. Well, when I say special, you got meat and vegetables on Sunday, so you didn't get that in here. You were on bread and water 7 days a week. And the people who were in here, for the most part, were in here for just a couple of days. The political prisoners fared less well, and some of the Fenian prisoners were kept in the punishment cells here for months, if not years. And one of them who was eventually released, they were released on condition that they go into exile, so he went to the US. His health was broken by the time he spent in here, and he died not long after his release. But he talked about how difficult it was to sleep in here or to get any peace of mind because of the wailing and knocking on the walls and doors of the other prisoners. So obviously the people who were in here were severely distressed, and this was not a pleasant place to be.
One of the areas the archaeologists are investigating is the development of the convict prison. A key area of research will be to contrast the 19th century prison to the 20th century that operated by the Irish state on the island from 1985 to 2004.
One of the things that's important to know is that prior to about 1800, long-term incarceration in prison was not an option. The only people who were kept in prison for relatively long periods of time were debtors, and then others who were kept in prison were those who were awaiting sentence. And that sentence usually involved either that you were let go, or that there was some kind of physical punishment, such as flogging, putting people in stocks, or execution. Then, of course, the other option was transportation, and transportation to the colonies had been used from about the Elizabethan period right up to 1800. But in 1800, after the loss of the what later became the United States, Australia filled that gap for transportation, but it was becoming increasingly expensive. And the whole concept of long-term incarceration in prison began to fill the gap in terms of how you punished criminals or offenders. So much of the architecture of the new prisons that were built from the 1800s onwards reflect the kind of philosophy of the period in terms of the need to rehabilitate prisoners, perhaps not in this life, but certainly in the next. So there was this notion of the reform of the prisoner's soul and the redemptive work, for example, in isolation, were felt to be the important ways that could be achieved. So in the architecture of some of the purpose-built prisons of that period, you see forced labour is a principal way of achieving this rehabilitation, and then you have the physical isolation of the prisoners. And the architecture of this space as a purpose-built prison space from the 1850s reflects that philosophy, that you could keep people in separate cells. And this system was known as the separate system. And the unsuitability of Spike Island as a prison is a constant theme running through the annual reports of the Inspectorate of Prisons from this period. And the main problem with Spike Island was the fact that most prisoners lived in dormitory style accommodation rather than in these separate cells such as what you see here. And it has always been a prison because it was built in the 1850s. When the prison closed here, the convict prison closed in 1883, the whole complex reverted to the military, so to the Army and the Navy, and this then became a military prison. Then when it was reopened by the Irish state as a prison in 1985, some prisoners were also housed in this block. And this was used as a punishment block in that period too. Prisoners were stripped of their underwear and kept in these cells. And I think the physical isolation and I suspect the cold and discomfort here was understood to be a very effective way of calming troublesome prisoners, because this building is not heated in any way. These cells were not heated in the modern era either. So you can imagine this building now, it would have looked different from what you see today. In the 1980s and 90s, the prison service stripped the render from these walls. So now you see this dark interior. These walls would have been rendered and painted white. So it wouldn't have been quite as grim as what you see today. But it would have been a cold, fridge-like building. And as I say, the physical isolation from other prisoners and the somewhat Dickensian conditions were seen as a very effective way of calming troublesome prisoners.
The excavation this year has concentrated on the officers' rooms in the punishment block. Next year, the archaeologists will begin to excavate the actual convict cells. The average length of time a prisoner spent in the modern era, 1985 to 2004, was 2 years, whereas the shortest sentence in the 19th century was 5 to 7 years. There is one case of a man who was convicted of murdering his wife, and he spent 27 years on spike before being released. One gets the sense that in the 19th century prison, incarceration was more about punishment, while in the 20th century prison, it was more about rehabilitation. Coming up in episode 5, the final episode, we take a detailed look at the convict burial grounds.